flurry of people coming into the call right now. So we're going to give a few more people time to get here, and we'll begin shortly. Thank you so much. Okay, it appears that we have slowed down with people coming into the call, so we are going to get started. Again, my name is Olivia Glenn. I'm our Deputy Commissioner for Environmental Justice and Equity here at DEP. And before we even begin, I just want to be sure that everyone is aware that we are recording this evening's meeting. And this meeting recording will be available publicly on our website as a record of our meeting for today. So I want to thank you all for joining us for this second Environmental Justice Stakeholder meeting. For tonight, we have two topics of discussion. One is to focus on geographic areas of comparison, and the second is to focus on facility and permit definitions. So this discussion here is building on a platform of discussion that we had about 3 months ago, actually, when we held our first meeting on October 22nd, and we talked about the environmental justice law overall. We gave a sense of what the framework was going to be for our rulemaking process, and the reason why environmental justice is so important in the state of New Jersey and in our nation. So we're not going to spend a lot of time revisiting those finer points this evening, but that recording and all of the materials from the October 22nd meeting are still available on our website. So if you missed that, you can certainly catch up on those respective matters. And for today, we're going to spend the time really dedicated to really getting into the substance of these two issues. Before we begin, I just want to touch base with some rules of engagement for us all. We have placed everyone on mute when they come into the call, but once you take your microphone off of mute, if you want to ask a question, you do not automatically remute. So we ask that you put yourself back on mute at that time. It will certainly help on the feedback and make sure we have a really solid recording for the record of our meeting this evening. Secondly, I just want to note that there is a raise your hand function in Microsoft Teams. If you look at the bar that is across the top of the screen, you'll see something that looks like this. That's a hand. If you click on that hand, it lets us know that you would like to make a comment, and we will recognize you to have a question addressed to the larger group. Right next to that hand raising function is a call box that looks like a cartoon thought on the side. And if you click on that, that's the chat function for Teams. And in that box, that's where you can write questions or comments. So if you have comments, you can submit them there. And if you have questions, we can certainly answer your questions through that venue as well. I'm going to ask that everyone who has verbal comments that they would like to make or questions they would like to ask to limit their time to 2 minutes. And once you've reached 90 seconds, you will see me raise my hand like this, just to help you keep track of time. And again, I just want to underscore, because I see there's still a flurry of people who are coming in, this meeting is being recorded. So participating in this conversation is your consent to being recorded. So can you go to the next slide, please? And the next slide, please. So tonight, before we get into the conversation about the geographic points of comparison and the facility and permit definitions, I just want to briefly touch on overburdened communities. What are they? And then give you just some update on where we are, because we did have a deadline within the legislation earlier this week. So this definition here comes directly from the legislation. And so this is the definition for an overburdened community, which is any census block group where there are at least 35% of the households who are low income, at least 40% where the residents are minority or members of a state recognized tribal community, or at least 40% of the households have limited English proficiency. So if a block group meets any one of those three criteria, it is in fact an overburdened community according to our legislation. You can go to the next slide. This map here shows you where the overburdened communities are in this spatial form. And you'll see some color coding here. The first category identifies, the green identifies just minority block groups. The second, which is a shade of blue, identifies those block groups that are both low income and minority. The third identifies those that are just low income. The darkest shade of blue identifies block groups that are low income, minority, and limited English proficient. The pink identifies those that are minority and limited English. And finally, that lighter shade of blue identifies those that are low income and limited English. You can get more specifics on this if you visit our nj.gov/DEP/EJ website, where you can learn a lot more about what communities these are. And what we did yesterday, in accordance with the legislation, is we provided documentation to all of the municipalities across the state that have overburdened communities so that they would know if they had block groups within their borders that fulfilled this criteria. So of course, that information is available to everyone. And New Jersey overall has 6,300 block groups. And of New Jersey's 6,300 block groups, 3,168 of them are considered overburdened. You go to the next slide, please. So these are just some of the specifics here that we made available on our website, primarily for municipalities, but also for public consumption overall. You can find an Excel spreadsheet that lists all the overburdened communities. You'll find PDF maps that are there, divided up by county, where you can see them for each municipality under the subset of the county. And then we have GIS tools that are also available. So the municipalities were notified yesterday electronically, and shortly, early in February, we're going to have a webinar whereby municipalities will be able to engage with us to ask us questions about this designation. And you're going to go to the next slide. Okay. And so at this point in time, I'm going to hand the floor over to my colleague, our Chief for Regulatory Affairs here at DEP, Sean Moriarty.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner Glenn, and good evening to everyone, and thank you again for joining us today to continue our conversation regarding the implementation of the environmental justice law. And as Olivia indicated, the first of our two topics for discussion today is what we've been calling the geographic point of comparison, and probably best to start with a brief refresher on what we mean when we use that term. And let's look at the key language from the law to inform that, and that language requires the department to compare the environmental and public health stressors faced by an overburdened community with those borne by other communities within the state, county, or other geographic unit as determined by the department. So based on that language, and as we shared during our last conversation, the department has looked at the analysis of a couple ways that we can address this requirement, and we're going to walk through today how that could work and what some of the results might look like. And that includes looking at comparisons to the state at the state and county levels, both including and excluding from that analysis the existing overburdened communities. And before we get there, let me provide just a little bit of background on how this and everything else we talk about today fits in with our overall strategy. We're building this rule through stakeholdering from the ground up and trying to take it in small, hopefully manageable pieces. No decisions have been made yet, and we really are seeking your input at each step of the way. And this is really step one of that conversation. So what we talk about today will be part of a larger method and approach that we are working to develop. And while we won't get to specific issues such as what types of stressors are we looking at, how will those stressors be evaluated and compared, and what will the ultimate permitting process look like, we will get to those conversations over the next couple of months. And Olivia will talk a little bit at the end about what that schedule looks like. So we just ask you to keep that in mind as we go through here, that we are trying to focus on this discrete issue, and we'll touch on other things as we go along. But I just want folks to understand how we're approaching this so you don't feel like we're not giving you the full information. I think if in light of that, there are things that you need more information on, or you'd like to withhold comments or take any positions on these things, we're certainly open to continuing this conversation as we work through some of these other pieces, and as always, taking written comments and feedback from you after this meeting goes. As we found out this morning, it might be a bit much that we're throwing at folks, so we're really absolutely open to hearing more from you once you've had a little bit more time to digest this. So as we move forward today, I'll be presenting a series of maps and tables with data and statistics to help explain what we've been seeing so far. And this as we've talked about, this information is intended to inform and to be open and transparent about the analysis we can do. It's not intended to confuse. So if there are any questions, please ask. Just raise your hand, and we'll get to you. Even if I'm in the middle of a slide, we'll stop and talk. We'd like to really make this as informal and open a conversation as we can today. And while at times I'll ask specific questions following slides, if anything comes up throughout the conversation, again, just raise your hand and we'll talk. I'll just point out, for illustration purposes, we have chosen one potential stressor for now. We will add more stressors to this analysis later, but based on the work that we have been doing, we do expect the results and kind of what you'll see here to be fairly similar for each of those stressors as what you're going to see today. So before we move on to kind of the meat of the discussion, I want to just talk briefly about the comments we received from the survey. Judging by what we received, I think we have to take some of the blame for not really doing the best job of articulating our question. I think we may have missed the mark. What we asked was, what is the appropriate geographic unit? What we probably should have asked, to be clearer, is what is the appropriate geographic unit for comparison. Based on our review of the comments, it seemed that some folks were understandably focused on ensuring that in that first instance, the overburdened community is looked at as discreetly and on the smallest level as possible. And I think that that's a result of a poor wording of the question on our part. But we think we were able to get some useful information out of this, folks pointing to state or county as being potential viable options, as well as people pointing to both state and county, which are some of the things that we talked about last time. And we're going to work through and walk through all of that information as we move forward. Okay. So as we talked about, we are going to use that example stressor, and the one we chose is the air cancer risk data developed by US EPA under the National Scale Air Toxics Assessment, or NADA, program, which estimates cancer risk from various sources of air pollution through inventory analysis and dispersion modeling. We picked this because it's a well-known data set, and it's used in similar tools like EPA's EJ screen, and we thought it would serve as a useful starting point for this analysis. And the numbers you see here, the units used for that NADA is cancer risk per million. So when you see on the screen, a mean of 249, that's 249 cases of cancer per million people. So the map you see in front of you right now shows New Jersey's NADA data separated into 10% increments. So approximately 630 of the 6,300 block groups, and show the distribution across the state. The areas that are in darker blue would represent the higher cancer risk, where the areas in yellow would represent the lower cancer risk. And I think that this, tells the story probably pretty well about where many of our overburdened communities already exist. When you look at this data, I think you'd see a fairly strong correlation between this type of data and the designation of as an overburdened block group under the environmental justice law. Just a couple of highlights from this table. The mean cancer risk, as indicated, is 249. The median, which is the same as the 50th percentile, is indicated at 222, and the 80th percentile, which is a higher statistical threshold, is 325. And we'll talk more about how those numbers play out as we move forward. So I think that sets the stage for what we're working with, and let's take the opportunity to look at it in a slightly different way. Okay. So this slide takes that prior analysis and shows what those numbers look like in the non-overburdened communities statewide. So now you're looking at the state numbers without including those areas classified as overburdened, and that leaves that would remove 3,154 block groups. And as you would expect, the numbers for these non-overburdened areas are lower than the state as a whole. For example, the median or 50th percentile is at 190 per million compared to the 222 we saw as the state for the state as a whole when you include those overburdened block groups. So continuing on, we'll shift our focus to the county level. Since I live in Camden County and I'm broadcasting from a basement therein, and since I got to be the one to do the talking today, I decided that we would use that as an example. So Camden County has 382 block groups. And looking at these numbers, they show that the NADA cancer risk for the county is generally lower than the state as a whole, median excluded, but higher than the state after you remove the overburdened communities. And I think when you look on this map and you look kind of at that color gradient, you can certainly see how those numbers are concentrated in the waterfront areas in and near Camden City. So continuing on this analysis train, we'll look at the fourth geographic unit that we've considered so far, the non-overburdened block groups in Camden County. Again, as expected, those non-OBC areas in Camden are lower than Camden as a whole. And we're highlighting here at both the 50th and 80th percentile numbers. So now you can see on a county level that numbers can be used as comparison areas to determine if an overburdened community block group is higher than, in the words of, that would be quoting the words of the legislation, those borne by other communities and potentially be subject to the permitting provisions of the environmental justice law. And the next slides, we'll look at how those overburdened community comparisons change for the different geographic areas using these two percentiles, both the 50 and the 80th percentile. So this gives us an opportunity to start to look at what this comparison might kind of show in practice. So we were able to break it down under each of the four scenarios for Camden County. That's looking at the county as a whole, the county without the overburdened communities, the state as a whole, and the state without the overburdened communities. And that chart, the chart in front of you shows the number of overburdened block groups that exceed the 50th percentile numbers that we showed you before to demonstrate which block groups are higher than those different levels. And again, those colors help to tell the story. The table is ranked from highest to lowest based on cancer risk levels in the different comparison areas. It shows that Camden County for this stressor, again, just our sample stressor, the county as a whole has the highest comparison level, a cancer risk of 237. With the state non-overburdened community area representing the lowest comparison level, 190 per million. So the map to the left represents that same data indicated in a table to kind of visually show where those block groups are that exceed those levels. So for example, if the county as a whole is used as comparison, we would capture 98 block groups. Those in dark green, again, largely concentrated near the waterfront, would be considered would be considered higher than the 237 cancer risk levels. Again, the highest number. Moving down the table, if we use the county non-overburdened community level, we would add an additional 4 block groups, and that would be added in that light green. We see we start to kind of move outward from the waterfront. Using the state number, that would add an additional 11 block groups. Those would be those dark blue that you see towards the middle there. And then if the state non-OBC area was used, again, the lowest of those numbers, we would have a total of 134 of Camden's block groups would be considered higher. And that's where you add those light blue numbers in. Excuse me. So if you took all of those numbers together using the lowest comparison number, that's what you would find at this level, at the 50th percentile level, to be higher than the comparison points. There also would be 46 block groups that meet the overburden overburdened community census criteria, what Olivia talked about earlier, but would not be considered higher than any of these geographic comparisons based on this sample stressor. And I think that looking at this, it pretty accurately tells the story of how these numbers work. The Camden City waterfront is obviously an area of concern, so it's captured even at the highest threshold. And as we move through those numbers, you can see how the protection spreads out to other areas. So now we'll take a look at that same comparison, but using the 80th percentile threshold as a point of comparison. This changes the ranking of the geographic areas slightly, with the state as a whole now being the highest level, and with the state non-overburdened community area is again at the lowest level. So we would have a total of 98 block groups would be considered higher if you look at all of these together compared to the 134 that we looked at for the 50th percentile comparison. Here, 82 block groups that meet the overburdened community census criteria would not be considered higher for any of those geographic comparisons, again, compared to 46 when we're looking at it on the 50% comparison. So we've looked at that now, kind of zoomed it down into a county. Let's see what it looks like if we zoom it back out to the state level. So the map in the table on the left shows the block groups and populations that are higher than percentiles ranging from 50 to 80 if we use the state as a comparison. So you see there with the darker blue at the top, those are the ones that would meet the, meet a certain level, and then that kind of moves down into the yellow. It shows that the population covered increases as you level from 80 to 50. Blue to green areas show the population covered by the different percentiles. The gray areas, again, indicate the overburdened block groups that meet the census criteria but do not exceed that 50th percentile across the state. If we use the 50th percentile as the higher than threshold, we would cover approximately 67% of the population in those overburdened block groups on that comparison. The map and table to the right shows that same information if we were to use the county as the comparison level. The population for the 50th percentile is slightly lower than the state at 60% coverage. But there are some more important differences that are apparent when you look at these two maps. First, several block groups in generally lower stress counties are now covered. Those are those ones you would see on that county map in the south, in areas such as Atlantic and Cumberland, and in the north in areas such as Somerset and Morris. Also, several block groups in the generally higher stress counties are not covered. That would be in Hudson, Middlesex, Bergen, and Union. And I think what jumps out at me as being particularly stark in this analysis is that bit of a donut hole you start to see up in the northeastern part of the state around Hudson County, where the county comparison ends up being higher because some of those counties are comparatively more stressed. So what this analysis highlights is that there are block groups where the stressor level is higher than the state, but lower than the county because the county, again, already has higher stress levels. Conversely, the opposite shows up in the comparatively cleaner, using our nomenclature, counties with lower stress levels than the levels of the state as a whole. When you go through the stressors, I think what I'm starting to see, and I think what's demonstrated here, is that there is a distinct lack of statewide uniformity in comparing the state and county levels. When you do state, you get a certain outcome, and when you do county, you get a slightly different outcome. And some of those differences can be crucially important as we move forward. So now we move on to the last two of our discrete examples, the state and county with the removal of those overburdened communities. Due to the lower stress levels in the non-overburdened community areas, we would cover a larger percentage of those overburdened communities in both instances. The state increases from 67 to 87% at the 50th percentile, and the county would increase from 60 to 65%. And again, that lack of uniformity statewide between the two comparisons shows up again. Let's take a look at the last of these slides. So again, recognizing the lack of statewide consistency and uniformity when making a state or county comparison, we looked at what we are calling the hybrid approach, which could potentially consider the lower of the state or county level. In doing this, we're considering whether it would be fairer and more equitable to provide a level of protection for relatively lower stress counties and using the state level for those higher stress counties. The map on the left is based on selecting the lower of the state or county level. The map on the right is the same, but we would remove the overburden overburdened community areas. At the 50th percentile level for the non-OBC combined approach, we would cover 87% of the overburdened community block groups, of the population in the overburdened community block groups compared to 78% for the state or county as a whole. Compared to the numbers, that would be compared to the numbers that were largely in the 60s when we used a one or the other approach. As you'll likely notice, when you take this combined approach, it does avoid some of those gaps in areas such as Hudson County, while also including some of those overburdened communities down in South Jersey. So we're hoping that that this analysis and what we've gone through helps to shed some light on our thought process, what we're thinking about as we're going through this issue, and illustrates the type of analysis we can do moving forward as we evaluate other stressors and develop a more complete method for implementation. We're certainly willing, and that this is coming directly from the folks who actually do the work, to do additional analysis, to consider different ideas and approaches that folks might suggest today. So with that, I'd like to open up the floor for questions, comments, and they can be in line with some of the things we have on the screen already. Are there other geographic units we should be looking at? Would a combination of the state or county be fairer and more equitable in providing that protection? Is there other analysis we can do, or anything that's off of those questions as well? Just hoping to use those as a way to spur on conversation. So we'll give it a second for folks to raise their hand or type their questions before we move on to the second part. And I think we'd also be open to any feedback that folks might have as to what they think, where they think we should land on this issue. And there's certainly an opportunity to say, if you think state or county is better, if you think that a hybrid approach is better, that's what we'd love to hear from you today.
Okay, great. We have a couple of hands coming through now. We'll start with Ana Baptista.
Hi, can you hear me?
We certainly can. Good evening.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Sean. And thank you for Olivia for sharing this very detailed analysis with us. It's been asking for comments. I have more of a comment, which is that, I think from the environmental justice perspective, it certainly makes sense to leave both the county and the state some combined approach on the table for consideration, so that you have the ability to really take into account very different patterns of distribution across the state, and also depending on the type of indicator you're looking at. And one thing that I think we really and I would like to see is that the comparison between the block group in question should be compared to non-overburdened block groups, ideally, so that you get a real sense of, how does this community fare when we look at the parts of our state that are not overburdened, and that is a fair comparison when the goal is environmental justice. So again, the comment would be that favoring a comparison to the non-overburdened community average, whether at the state or county, whichever is most protective. So I just wanted to make that comment, and I think it will be interesting to see also, this comparison across different indicators, and obviously the comparison when we look at even a trend below the 50th percentile, so that we can see how does the sort of a sensitivity analysis of this even below 50th percent. That was my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana. That's really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ana. Next, we have Amy Goldsmith.
Hi, thank you, all of you, for the incredible work that you've been doing. I know it's amazing that all the data that you can put together and the mapping that you can do. We should do more of it. As you indicated in the beginning, you were just looking at the native data, just to give an example of one stressor, and that you're going to be doing many more stressors. Can you explain a little bit about how you're selecting them, or if there's certain ones that you've decided not to select, you know, of sort of typical EJ stressors. And then how are you going to overlay the stressors, and do you think there's going to be are you hoping that what you're showing here today isn't going to vary that much? You'll just show more stressors on top of it, but that you're trying to figure out if this might be the general pattern, so that you can pick something, because you can't change what you're doing every single time you do a stressor, probably.
Yeah, yes. I'll answer those backwards. I think
Okay.
you kind of nailed it with that last comment in terms of what we're talking about. I think based on some of our preliminary work with different stressors, we think that this is a representative demonstration of what the analysis looks like when you apply it across a bunch of different stressors. So I do think that that's where we are. What we're really trying to do is, receive feedback if we can get, I don't want to say consensus, but if there's kind of a clear direction that our stakeholders would like us to head in, that we may be able to focus some of that analysis going forward with the additional stressors in that direction. And if what we're hearing is, we want the most protective, we want the lowest, we want that either or hybrid approach, then, it allows us to kind of hopefully whittle down some of the analysis we need to do for that larger group of stressors. But if we need to do it, we'll do it. As far as the first part of your question, in terms of what we've identified, that's going to be the topic of our next conversation. I want to defer the specifics there. Olivia will talk about at the end exactly how we're going to do that, when those dates are going to line up. But the next conversation we have, which will be in, I think, less than a month from now, we're going to specifically lay out what stressors we're looking at, what we're not looking at, and why. So you're going to get kind of, hopefully you will understand it to be the same level of thoroughness and disclosure that we're going through with this, as we tackle that next topic, which we recognize is a big one.
Thank you, and I would support, as Anna and probably others will say, whatever we can be most protective and most differentiate, because I think it is important for people to understand that there is a difference. Yep. We're not here, and the differences are obvious.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Amy. Next is Joanne Held.
Hi, thank you. I guess I also would second or third what Anna said about comparing to the non-overburdened blocks would make a lot of sense in this case. I think I might push a little harder than Amy on the geographic comparison, though, because I'm thinking, I know for air, maybe it makes sense to compare to county or state levels, but for something, say, and I haven't looked at the list of stressors because we don't really have that whole list yet, but something like arsenic in drinking water, it depends on your geology. If it's something like, water in your, contaminated fish in your watershed, might depend on the watershed that you're in. So I guess I would kind of reserve judgment on whether or not you'll be able to actually say, okay, we always do it exactly this way. You might need to vary it a little bit for some of the stressors where it just doesn't make sense to do a state or county comparison. And I don't know for sure because I haven't seen the list. I just would like to hold that out.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I think, I think that this topic is certainly open for revisiting as we look at those stressors. And if there are particular ones where folks feel like we need to take a different approach, we're certainly open to having that conversation. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Nikki Sheets.
Thank you. Hi, Olivia. Hi, Sean. Thanks to both of you for your presentations. I wanted to second Anna and Amy and Joanne and take one step further and say, I think it should be the comparison should be to the non-overburdened communities, and it should be the 50th percentile and not the 80th percentile. And because I think what we want to achieve at a minimum is that in general, I think a fairness argument says that you don't want the block group to be any more burdened than the average of the non-overburdened communities. I mean, I think that's at a minimum. And then once we achieve that, we need to take it further and even, we need to reduce the burden everywhere, as the native cancer data shows us, right? Because it's too high. The average in the state's too high for all block groups. But then, then we can talk about taking further steps to help, to even lower it in the non-overburdened communities. And I think taking the 50th percentile, is the fairest thing, as opposed to taking the 80th percentile, which will protect fewer communities. And you're saying, well, it's all right if this community is dirtier than the average non-overburdened community. And I don't think it is all right. And I just want to remind folks that when we're looking at the overburdened communities, we're already only looking at a subset of all communities in New Jersey. And then when we start saying, well, what are we going to compare it to, 50th or 80th percentile, we keep paring down the number of communities we're looking at, right? So we keep decreasing the number of communities that we're talking about protecting. And so it's not as many communities as it may seem like when you first look at the maps.
Yeah.
And so thanks for the graphs. As usual, I would like to live with them a little bit longer also.
Just please do. Take as much time as you need, and well said as always, Dr. Sheets.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now jumping over to the chat thread, I see that Dave Pringle was pretty much underscoring some of what was already raised. And we have Hugh, who was co-signing what Mr. Pringle said. So I'm going to jump down to Ray Nichols to ask if he would like to elaborate on what he submitted in the chat.
Thank you. I worked in DEP for over 20 years and in regulatory programs. And one of the things that I noticed that was ignored mostly is the various geologic units of the state. The geology in Sussex County is incredibly different than the geology in Cape May or Atlantic counties. And that in turn affects the movement of air and water within those areas. And so I think that the geology needs to be taken into consideration, because we're talking about the movement of contaminants in both of those vectors. And I think with air pollution, asthma in certain communities is definitely, overburdened communities is much more common if there are air polluting facilities in the vicinity. So I just think that, the air currents need to be taken into account as well. And that's a function of geology, and the department has excellent geographic maps, geological maps, and also watershed maps that it should be overlaid to see what effect they would have. I don't know what the results would be, but that's what my point is.
Thank you, Ray. We'll take that into account. Absolutely.
Okay,
Just,
next.
I think, I'm sorry, go ahead, Lily. Yeah.
No, go ahead, Sean, finish your thought.
Oh, no, I was just going to point out that for folks with the chat, if you've put a comment in the chat, we're going to note that and write it down, and we'll be looking at that. So we'll try to answer the questions as Olivia is going through, but we'll just kind of note the comments and take them into account as we go forward, since we don't have to, just so we don't have to read everything. That was it.
Okay, perfect. So next we're going to jump to Natalie Augusto Filion, followed by Kimmy Way. And they both put questions in the chat, Sean.
Oh, sure. Sorry. So Natalie asked, how frequently does DEP anticipate updating the analysis? I guess I could try to answer this two ways. I think if we're talking about the analysis of where those overburdened communities lie and that kind of the beginning piece, that's going to be updated at least every 2 years. And that would be done in accordance with the statute. We'll be updating our maps and all that information that we have available. If you're talking about updating the analysis that we're doing, I mean, what we've done is use the most recent data. So as new data comes out, we'll be updating that analysis as routinely as we can. And we'll be continuing to run this analysis with different stressors as we go forward. So, you know, I think that'll be part of that continued conversation. You'll have an opportunity to see what that ends up looking like as we move forward. Kimmy Way was asking about the way to see other participants. I think we are slightly limited in our regards, but people who have cameras on, you can see them, but because we have the PowerPoint up, it might limit who you actually see on the screen. I didn't see Dan. I didn't see Mr. Van Avs as a question. I saw it more as a comment. Dan, if you would like to elaborate or something, I'm happy to talk. But we kind of noted that as being a comment more than a question. Not that we were attempting to ignore your input.
I'm hoping that my comment is complete, so no question.
Okay. Great, thank you. Thank you. I do not want anyone to feel that we've overlooked them. Okay. Thank you again. Great feedback, and we particularly appreciate folks kind of giving us a direction to try to head a little bit more in as we move forward. So, with that, I guess we'll move on to kind of the second aspect of this conversation for today, and that is looking at the facility and permit definitions. So, as you might recall, the law kind of establishes a three-pronged test of applicability for those additional protections that would be required under the law. So first is whether the facility in question is one of the 8 types of facilities listed in the law, and those are what's shown on the screen. Those are major sources of air pollution, resource recovery facilities and incinerators, sewage treatment plants, transfer stations and solid waste facilities, recycling facilities, scrap metal facilities, landfills, and medical waste incinerators. So that's your first prong. The second question is whether one of those facilities is seeking one of the subset of environmental permits listed in the bill. And that includes solid waste and recycling permits, our development permits out of our watershed land management program. Those include wetlands, CAFRA, flood hazard, as well as water supply and water pollution permits, air pollution permits, and pesticide permits. So just a reminder here that those permits do exclude remediation permits or minor modifications to major source air permits that do not increase emissions. So those would not be included. And the third prong is obviously whether that facility is seeking the permit is located or proposed to be located in an overburdened community. So while the law defines what is considered an overburdened community, which we've talked about already, it does largely leave to the department the responsibility to better define those facilities and permits. And that's what we're going to discuss today. To try to kind of lay out how we might go about doing that. As a regulator, we have many regulations, and some of those regulations contain definitions that could be incorporated or where they don't line up exactly, which is frankly largely the case when we compare regulations to the bill. Those definitions could be modified for incorporation into this rulemaking. So in light of that, we felt it might be a useful way to frame this discussion is for each of those facilities you see on the screen here, we're going to go through and show you how they're defined in our regulations using as plain English as we can and as a lawyer's non-lawyerly language as possible in our regulations or where conversely they're not defined in the regulations. Talk about the boundaries of those definitions, solicit feedback on each. If any of this ends up being too technical, or kind of, some people are well steeped in the regulations and some people know what's going on in their neighborhoods, and we welcome feedback on both of those regards. So we'd really be hopeful for folks to let us know how they would define those facilities and what about those facilities are causing problems in your neighborhoods. And that will kind of hopefully help us to find those key aspects of those facilities so that we can make sure that they're included in the definitions. So as I said, we're going to go through each. That general invite for questions on each of these slides is out there. Please raise your hand. Please put a question in the comment box as we go through. We'll stop and answer them, but it may end up being a little bit smoother to allow that to happen than for me to specifically stop after every single slide and ask you the same questions over and over again. So if we're moving forward, please don't take that as any indication that that we're not interested in hearing from you on any specific topic. So let's start with major sources of air pollution. Despite what I just went to great lengths to lay out, the EJ bill does actually provide us with the definition of a major source. And that definition includes a reference to the Federal Clean Air Act and our Air Pollution Control Act, as well as a reference to facilities which directly emit or have the potential to emit 100 tons per year or more of any air pollutant or other applicable criteria set forth in the Federal Clean Air Act. So, given the statutory direction, one thing we're looking at is whether it would just be appropriate to incorporate the definitions of major sources at major facilities. Those are connected from a regulatory perspective, but that major source being the key there, and their associated pollutant thresholds into the rulemaking. Now, this would cover electric generation facilities, refineries and waste handling facilities, including wastewater plants, municipal waste combustors, incinerators, and landfills. So, I think that the first question here is, do folks have concerns with that approach? Do they feel like, wholesale adoption of a definition from our regulations would miss something of concern? Are there other concerns with this approach that we would not be addressing based on the language of the bill? And so I do want to stop here because I know this is an important topic. I'll give a second for folks if they want to raise their hands before we move on to the next thing. Okay, we'll move ahead. Obviously, we'll leave that open for folks as we continue through. So the second kind of big bucket of facilities are solid waste facilities, and that really is because many of the facilities covered under the bill would fall into kind of that broad category of solid waste facilities. That would include resource recovery facilities, incinerators, transfer stations, recycling facilities, and landfills. So as part of this, we would likely include a general definition that covers those facilities, pulling from our solid waste regulations, and develop specific definitions for each type of facility, which we will go forward and discuss now. Sorry, I'm just reading comments in the question box. Okay, so starting with incinerators. So incinerators are defined in both our Solid Waste and Air Pollution Control Act rules. And they're generally characterized to include facilities that reduce, destroy, or salvage materials by combustion. Now, those materials within those definitions would include solid waste, garbage, debris, and human and pet remains. So you're looking at something from your standard solid waste incinerator all the way to a crematory. That would fall within the definition of incinerators. To address the statutory requirements, we would likely need to expand that definition to include sludge and medical waste, as the statute calls for us to consider the impacts of sludge incineration and medical waste incinerating facilities. I'll just note here that the definition of incinerator specifically excludes control technologies that are placed on some of these facilities, as well as resource recovery facilities, which are otherwise defined under the bill. So again, if folks have input on whether this captures what you would consider to be an incinerator within your communities, what you would consider to be an incinerator that is causing stress on you and your families, we want to make sure we're hitting that as part of that definition. So moving on to resource recovery facilities. Again, you're going to hear this a lot, but we kind of have a similar approach here. That resource recovery facilities are helpfully defined in both our Solid Waste and our Air Pollution Control Act rules. And they're defined as facilities used for processing, incineration, or other means for the separation of solid waste or recycling for reuse, energy production, or material recovery. And we would consider potentially incorporating this definition and those types of hallmarks to address resource recovery facilities. Similarly, again, with transfer stations, those are also defined in our solid waste rules as facilities where solid waste is transferred from one vehicle to another. That includes rail for off-site transportation. And that definition specifically excludes self-generated on-site movement. So a facility is moving its own material in its own trucks on its own site, that's not considered a transfer station. Under our regulations, what's considered a transfer station is a facility that accepts that material, moves it to something else, and then moves it out of its facility. Now we get to recycling facilities, and this is one where we're going to have some specific questions that we're going to likely want to speak about. So this is where we have a similar but not direct corollary in our regulations. Under our recycling rules, there is a definition of recycling centers. Now that includes Class B, C, and D recycling facilities. What it excludes, and that's a statutory exemption, is Class A recycling facilities. And those are the facilities that deal with the things that at least I would expect a recycling facility to deal with, the stuff that we put out at our curb. So those facilities are not specifically regulated under our recycling permit regulations. So I think one of the questions that we're looking for feedback on is how should we deal with Class A recycling facilities? And we've certainly heard from folks that those facilities bring benefits and that they should be excluded, but we also understand that they bring stressors. And we want to talk about, particularly to folks here, about whether those facilities should essentially be included in the environmental justice assessment, where they are excluded in our kind of permitting paradigm, where we don't necessarily directly get to their operations from the department perspective. So if folks have feedback on that, we'd very much like the opportunity to hear from you on that issue. Theoretically, with that permit and facility nexus that we need to find in order to apply the conditions of the environmental justice rule, if a Class A recycling facility is seeking another one of those permits, potentially even a watershed land management permit, that could be a way in which those facilities are regulated under the bill. And I'll leave that out there to hear from people as we move forward. Landfills. So under our rules define landfills using the term sanitary landfill, and that includes those places where waste is deposited as fill for the purposes of permanent disposal or storage for more than 6 months. And that excludes hazardous waste disposal facilities, which are defined elsewhere in our rules. So part of what we're thinking about here is, do we adopt the definition of sanitary landfill as a way to address landfills under the bill? And should that definition be expanded in some way to include hazardous waste landfills? Hazardous waste landfills and hazardous waste disposal are not specifically called out in the bill, but is a landfill a landfill, and should that include a hazardous waste landfill? It's part of what we're asking ourselves at this point. Sewage treatment plants, and those are ones that handle more than 50 million gallons per day. Here, the department regulations do not specifically define a sewage treatment plant. So as we were considering available definitions and things that we could point to, we were looking at potentially incorporating the definition of treatment works from our NJPTES, or New Jersey Pollutant Discharge and Elimination System rules. And that would include both public and private facilities that store, treat, recycle, or reclaim municipal or industrial liquid waste, and include stormwater runoff or industrial waste in combined or separate stormwater and sanitary sewer systems. So we felt that where we more often regulate public treatment works, that adopting a definition that included both public and private might get us a lot closer to meeting the intent of the bill, which does not draw a distinction between ownership in those facilities. Next, we would look at sludge processing facilities, combustors, and incinerators. So as we talked about already, we would be looking to define the term sludge and have that be included in our general incinerator definition, so that we get to the incinerator / combustor part of that statutory language. And that's partly because a sludge processing facility is not defined in any of our existing statutes or regulations. So what we might do, and what we're looking at, is incorporating a definition of sludge as you see on the screen, and then including those appropriate cross references to the potential disposal methods. And the ones that come to my mind when I think about that are landfills, incinerators, and treatment works. So each of those definitions would also have a reference to sludge to make sure that those disposal methods for sludge are being addressed. And sludge being solid or semi-solid or liquid waste generated from municipal, commercial, or industrial wastewater treatment plants, water supply treatment plants, or an air pollution control facility. One thing that we need to ask ourselves, and one thing that we're considering, is whether we need to create in some way additional definitions or expand on this definition to address processing methods that are not otherwise covered by the existing regulations. Again, landfills, incinerators, and otherwise. So one of the things that we'd be interested in hearing from people is, are there other ways that sludge is processed that we haven't quite thought of that we would need to make sure we address, or at least consider addressing, to make sure that we're actually getting our arms around the issues that these sludge facilities do present to the communities. And I think that that approach is similar when we talk about scrap metal facilities. So again, we do not have a specific corresponding definition to scrap metal facilities, but we do regulate scrap metal shredding facilities under our solid waste rules. And those are places that receive vehicles, appliances, and other metals for shredding and transfer. And part of the question we're asking ourselves is, does that cover what the facilities that are of concern? Does that define, at least in your minds, what a scrap metal facility is in your community, one that is causing you problems? So we want to make sure that we're covering those, but we don't necessarily have a clear regulatory corollary there. So if we need to modify or expand that definition somehow, we would be looking to do so with your feedback. So as I've gone through that, I'm going to be a great place to take a pause. We have a hand up, which is just absolutely perfect timing. So let's see if we can address some of the questions that may have come in the chat, as well as the hand up.
So Cynthia Mellon, since you have your hand raised, we'll begin with you.
Hi, yeah, my name is Cynthia Majon. I'm a resident of Newark. With regard to the scrap metal facilities, certainly the shredding facilities are a problem, but we also have scrap metal facilities where when they do the dumping, huge clouds of dust are raised. I mean, the facilities in themselves are a problem, the daily activities there. So I think that should be taken into account and broadened. Thank you.
Sure. Is there, it might be helpful, is there a specific facility that you're talking about that maybe we could look at that would help us to inform ourselves?
Yes, it's on Malvern Street in Newark. And I can't think of its name, but I could certainly send it, or you can put it in the chat. But I've watched, I mean, there's been numerous complaints for years by the neighbors because it's grandfathered into a place where it's all residential or mostly residential, but I have actually spent enough time watching their operations to see what some of the problems are.
Thank you. I think we have something in the chat from Drew.
Perfect, he knows.
H&C Metals, is that
that's right.
About? Great,
yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's a great place for us to start. Thank you so much.
Okay, Dr. Baptista?
Yeah, I think this discussion of facilities raises all sorts of memories of looking at all manner of permits and proposals that have come into the city of Newark over many decades, many of which are for like new technologies and new processes that don't exist in, not only don't exist in New Jersey, but in some cases don't exist anywhere else in the country. Things like ASR, when gasification and pyrolysis was becoming a big thing, they came first to Newark. There are so many like new and emerging combustion type of processes. We have now a permit on biochar processing facility that wants to come to Newark. So I want to encourage there's got to be some kind of language that captures new and emerging processing facilities that can capture some of that. I know there's also like a lot of discussion of biomass, and other types of facilities that use some type of combustion and waste products. So I think that's really, really important, especially in a place like Newark, where you see so many of these facilities trying to be cited and permitted, and to stay ahead of some of that. And I agree with Cynthia, it's really important to consider the Class A and a variety of types of scrap metal facilities. We have Sims Metals Management in the city of Newark, and I know in other places in New Jersey that does very large scale deconstruction of subway cars and and then very small mom and pop scrap metalers that are taking electronics and household items as well.
Thank you, Anna. And I think I'm going to confess, I think I might have not included some of the pertinent language when we were talking about incinerators and resource recovery facilities, because I think that combustion piece, which you're honing in on, is really one of the keys there. And if I didn't highlight that enough, I should have. And I think that certainly from my perspective, the intent would be to get at those other emerging technologies, and we would definitely endeavor to use language that's broad enough.
And
So thank you.
I just want to mention the city of Newark has in their zoning code a list of prohibited uses in their under their industrial zoning, under their I3 zoning, that was written into the code with the input of communities and other folks. And that might be also a useful list to look at and cross-check against.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Dr. Sheets.
And I just wanted to put a plug in for not forgetting the traffic, particularly the diesel traffic that are associated with these and other facilities. And I think I've heard you say this before, Sean, and taking that into account when you're talking about these facilities and maybe other types of facilities that you wouldn't normally think you should consider, but that may draw large amounts of diesel traffic.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that's exactly where we'll be focused as we move this forward. I mean, this is kind of like, let's just define what that actual area looks like, and then we need to build out from there and define what the associated stressors that come with that, and diesel and traffic and all of those things I think are absolutely going to be included in that.
Okay, I think we're good to go.
All right. Okay, so it's kind of the last piece to walk through. So as we talked about, you have to be a covered facility, and you also have to have a covered permit. And that's a pretty extensive list, as you see here. And we're going to kind of go through kind of each of those permits. I'll just talk a little bit about what they cover and kind of get feedback if folks think that, particularly in situations where, we have permitting thresholds. You can go to the next slide, Julie. We're kind of starting with the idea of, defining permits in accordance with those statutory and regulatory definitions and applying, the EJ specific regulatory criteria where a permit is otherwise required for a facility. So, this kind of goes back to that Class A facilities situation, which I keep using as an example because it's the easiest one for me to understand. If you're looking at our solid waste permits and you're saying, is a permit triggered for a Class A facility? It is not. So, what is triggered are those other classes of facilities. So it's an easy way to say, if you're a recycling facility and you require a recycling permit, then you're subject to the bill. But some of those things are not necessarily covered. So we want to try as we can talk about where those thresholds are, talk about where things might be excluded, and kind of considering the connection between the permit and the facility, whether there are things we need to look out for. And I think some of this will be hopefully not too redundant, but it might be a little repetitive of what we've talked about already. But to the extent it spurs on additional thoughts, additional conversation, that's where we want to head. So, so let's just kind of start with our Air Pollution Control Act permits. Those are implemented through our Air Pollution Control Act rules, and those govern the emission of and activities that result in the introduction of contaminants into the ambient into the ambient atmosphere. And those would likely cover all of our major sources of air pollution, which we addressed earlier, as well as that includes incinerators and some of these other emitting sources. So if you're going to need an Air Pollution Control Act permit for one of those sources, you're going to be subject to the requirements of the bill. And I think we'll have that'll look similar as we go forward. Our solid waste permits, now those are permits that will be issued either under the Solid Waste Management Act and our solid waste rules, which govern things like the registration, operation, maintenance, and closure of landfills, other solid waste facilities, and other things regarding those transporting operations and facilities. That covers solid waste facilities generally, resource recovery facilities, transfer stations, landfills, and incinerators. We also have our New Jersey statewide mandatory source separation and recycling act and our recycling rules, which govern the operation of those recycling centers we talked about. And those cover those recycling centers intending to receive more than 100 tons of material per year. But again, as we talked about, would exclude those Class A facilities from that permitting paradigm. As I've seen in the comments, it does seem like people would suggest that they be included, and that's certainly not something that is surprising to us. Moving forward, we have our water resource management permits. Those are permits under the Water Supply Management Act or the Water Pollution Control Act. As we talked about a little bit already, the Water Pollution Control Act is implemented through our NJPTES rules, and that governs the discharge of pollutants to surface and groundwaters throughout the state. That includes treatment works, landfills, and some of the other facilities that have those discharges that are ancillary to their overall operation. And the Water Supply Management Act permits deal largely with water supply wells. So if a facility is seeking a water supply well, seeking the ability to tap into groundwater or otherwise, that would potentially bring it under the auspices of the environmental justice bill. Additionally, this is a big category. This actually spans 2 slides. Are our watershed and land management permits, and those are our development permits. They protect our water resources, govern development in our shore areas, near water bodies, and in wetlands. And I think as folks who are at all familiar with this type of permitting, it does have the potential to cover almost any facility if it lies within a jurisdictional area. So one of the specific questions we're asking ourselves, and we would ask you to the extent you are in position to give us input, is should a development permit alone, where we would not otherwise regulate operations, again, my favorite example in the world, Class A recycling facilities, would that development permit alone be sufficient to trigger the requirements of the environmental justice bill? And that's a question we're asking ourselves right now as we see how this process might play out within the different permitting thresholds and within the different facility definitions. And lastly, is kind of these stray permits that are a little less clear to us, but important nonetheless. First of those regulated medical waste permits, those would cover the medical waste incinerators. I think that it ends up being fairly straightforward. One that is a little less straightforward for me, at least, is the inclusion of pesticide permits in the bill. I think it is understandable that those permits could be applied for by many of these facilities, but we were trying to drill down, at least in our minds, as to where we think they might specifically apply and what we would need to be looking out for there. So if anybody has any feedback on the inclusion of pesticide permits and the things that we should really be focusing on there, that would be wonderful to help us with. So with that, I'll again open it up to questions. This is a free-flowing and very open Q&A now. You don't have to say anything related to the slide I'm on. So any questions that folks want to ask, it's fair game. Okay. We don't have any hands up, so I guess we should try some of the questions in the chat. Joanne Held, if a facility is not a major air facility but is subject to another covered permit, would the air emissions be considered in the cumulative impact study? I think that's a fair question. I think we're still working to develop the process. That actually teases out an interesting wrinkle that I had not at least specifically considered already, but I think that's something we'll want to talk about, at least in our minds. I think generally, if you're triggering the requirements, you're going to need to look at your impacts, but whether because that facility falls below the threshold, there's a reason to think that it should be looked at differently. We'll certainly look at that, but I think we're kind of looking at that as a triggering threshold, and then you would be required to address the concerns outlined in the environmental justice regulations. The question about will fumigation sites be included from Lauren Keltos. I'm actually quite interested in that. I don't know, Lauren, if it's possible for you to elaborate on that at all. I think there's a question about how exactly it would fit, but I think I do understand why that is important based on what we've been talking about. And I'm wondering if that is one way that we potentially get that connection with pesticide permits. So thank you. If you care to say anything else, we certainly want to hear from you. If you don't want to just listen to me read and answer all the questions.
Yeah, I was thinking along the lines of, fumigation sites don't necessarily always trigger the threshold of being a major status air pollution facility.
Right.
And I'm not sure of any other of the facility of the regulate, what we're looking for as far as facilities and the permitting threshold, if fumigation would trigger that. But, you know, it's definitely something that occurs in overburdened communities, and it's a new and emerging industry that's only being more recently attempted to be regulated and has a really high potential for impacting communities. And another new and emerging source is marijuana grow facilities, particularly with the new legislation, you know, that was agreed upon to legalize not just medical marijuana, but now recreational. Marijuana grows and dispensaries are popping up all over in overburdened communities and just communities in general, and the associated issues with them. It's a potential burden on all communities.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful. We'll dig down deeper into that and see exactly how it might fit in. Ray Nichols asks, how are classic junkyards or automotive storage yards where there is no metal shredding regulated? Are they considered unregulated scrap metal facilities? Yeah, it seems that best we can tell that those types of facilities are not specifically regulated, but that's exactly what we were trying to get to. We kind of maybe need to reorient our thinking on scrap metal facilities more towards junkyards, or at least in addition to those shredding facilities, things that are considered more akin to junkyards than what we would have otherwise been thinking. So it's really, really valuable feedback. Thank you. We have some hands up.
We can start with Cynthia Mayone.
Yes, with regard to the scrap metal, especially automotive junk, there's a lot of contaminants, including mercury in steering components and so on. So though it seems odd that they aren't regulated, and I'm thinking of events like when the Sandy flood happened, and you know that water washed over scrap metal automotive in Newark, right? And then later that water ended up in people's houses and stuff like that. So I don't think it's right that automotive scrap not be regulated. I think that needs another look. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I don't mean to say that it's not something that we should or will be considering as part of this specific regulation. I'm just saying that it's not clear to us how they're regulated under our existing rules, and that's something we need to look at as well. But we're really trying to dig down into what those facilities are. And I think I at least personally feel like I have a much better handle on what we should be looking at and how we should be considering that after having this conversation. So thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Sheets.
And I think the argument, I'm looking at Dave Pringle's comment saying cover as much as possible. You know, I think another thing that the law does for us is if you cover facilities that you're wondering about, like the recycling facilities, Sean, and water resource facilities, and even those facilities that we agree deliver some type of public good. But you know, we need to know what else are they delivering to these communities, and that gives us a better idea of what's happening in the EJ communities that we don't have now. Going through that EJ analysis would be crucial, so we really get a better idea of what's happening in the EJ community and what's contributing to the overall pollution load. And you know if they're not contributing, then you know that, but you may also capture some facilities that you would have thought were not contributing a lot, but when you actually do the EJ analysis, you see that, okay, this is an issue.
Thank you, Nikki. Amy asks, if you regulate new types of facilities in the future, will they be included in the future enforcement under the cumulative impact law and regulations? If they would, if we were to change the definition of something, I think that's part of what we see as a potential benefit to the way we might structure this in terms of creating cross references. Say we amend the definition of scrap metal shredding facilities to include junkyards where they don't do the shredding, right? Just to take an example we've talked about, that would then ultimately be incorporated into the environmental justice regulations. I think that's part of how we think we might be able to make this more living, make these regulations kind of move with the times and move with how we end up regulating as the department. So that's certainly something that we're looking at, and our intent in all of that, whether it's a clear cross-reference or not, is to ensure that the environmental justice regulations are up to date and in line with our regulatory thinking at all times. So if we're expanding regulation to some other area, and it would be, I would touch on one of the things that are covered by this bill, we would make sure that it's included. Dave Pringle asks, how can you not require them to be included in the cumulative impact study, asking about the emissions? I'm not saying that they're not. I'm just saying that, this is, we're trying to take this in discrete pieces. And when we get to the point of talking about the process in more depth, we'll have some answers for you for exactly how we would look at those issues. Okay, so Philip Savoy, and I'm certain I'm getting your last name wrong, and I very truly do apologize. If you'd like to speak, otherwise I can read your question. It's very good, but I don't want to speak for you if you'd prefer to speak for yourself.
You can read it if you like, not a problem.
Okay, so it says if a large source is in an overburdened community but provides a necessary service for the overall larger regional population, like a regional sewer treatment plant, how will the legislation reconcile this? Additionally, these plants are not easily situated due to the engineering of a plant, the need for gravity flow, wastewater to the plant. Additionally, many developers are building housing closer and closer to plants, which cannot just pick up and move like a factory. How will DEP reconcile this? So I think there's two parts there. One, if those facilities are existing, we would be, the department is only empowered to place additional conditions on their permits when they come in for renewal. So those permits would not, or those facilities would not necessarily be discontinued, but the legislation would require the department to, if necessary to protect public health, to put additional conditions on those permits. So that's what we would do. If those types of facilities were seeking to be located as a new facility within an overburdened community, then we would need to look at that facility and determine what types of stressors it would be adding. And I think that goes back to Dr. Sheets's point that even facilities that bring benefits, that's not necessarily a reason for them to simply be excluded from the analysis. So that's something that we need to work through to make sure that we are meeting the intent of the legislation and addressing the stressors that these facilities bring, even if they do bring additional benefits. And I think as we will lay out in future conversations when we start to discuss the process, to discuss the permitting in more detail, we hope that we'll be able to bring something that reconciles those issues, that recognizes the multiple both impacts and benefits that some of these facilities can bring, and does that in a way that meets the intent of the legislation.
Thank you for your answer. It is a concern because, quite frankly, if you start to look at some of the more historically developed areas of the state, as business and industry moves out and more residential housing or housing moves in, you are going to need plants like this to handle things like wastewater or, frankly, solid waste. They are not going away, and you just can't say, well, we're going to get rid of them because we don't like them. Doesn't mean they shouldn't be looked after to limit those impacts on the people that live around them. I wouldn't want to live next to a sewage treatment plant that smells. I agree with that 100%. But I think, too, that it's unreasonable to expect that these sources are just going to go away because people don't like them. Unfortunately, they are a necessary evil. That's my comment on that. Never mind.
Okay, thank you. We have a hand up from
Vicky
Oliver. Vicky Olivia.
So,
Sorry, it's Vicky Olivier. I just have a quick question as far as have federal facilities have been have they been considered on how they dispose their waste or their materials? I know that some of them tend to use private contractors, so that might fall outside of certain state and federal regulations. So I was just wondering if those facilities like the Joint Base or anything like that have been considered.
Well, something we'll need to look at. As the lawyer, I think I would need to defer on that as we look at the what ways in which we can impose state regulation on federal facilities, and that's likely fairly limited. So I think we would need to dig into that to see whether if a covered facility is within one of those bases, whether we can or cannot address it. So that's something that we'll certainly flag for further review and discussion.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Sorry.
In the chat, it looks like Natalie Augusto Filion put in a question.
Sorry, I'm just gonna kind of scroll in.
7:21 p.m.
Okay. Will there be an expectation for facilities to prepare and provide the kind of environmental justice analysis at the moment of permit renewal, or will the department's findings be the primary or sole source of evidence and the data to inform those decisions? Excuse me. A little ahead of where we are in the process, but I would say that the bill requires the preparation of environmental justice impact statement for both new and renewals. So I don't think that the department will be the primary or sole source of evidence or information on any of these decisions. Some of the other people are asking what are very important questions about how how total emissions and things will be calculated. We're going to need to reserve that for another conversation. I think we're going to need to be a little bit more prepared to discuss that in detail than we are at this particular moment. But we will note those so that we are prepared to discuss them in more detail when the time is right. I am scrolling through here. If anyone else has questions that they want to raise, please feel free to put your hand up. I want to make sure that we don't miss anyone in the chat as I'm going through this. I think, excuse me. There's a question about limitations that are inherently involved in this bill that we'll need to include in another bill. I don't think that's necessarily a question we can answer at this time. Sally G asks, regarding bus garages, will idling laws be better enforced? I think a little bit beyond the scope of this conversation, but the department is very committed to addressing idling across the state, particularly in overburdened communities, and things like bus garages are certainly on the top of our list as part of where we would focus there. And then Natalie Augusto Filion asks, before I wrap, would you kindly synthesize the most commonly articulated points? There were several instances where folks agreed, held up comments by previous speakers. Okay, so I will try my best. I think what I've heard so far is that that when we're doing a geographic point of comparison, using the lowest number, potentially that hybrid approach, and specifically excluding the overburdened communities from that analysis would be the appropriate direction to head. I think we heard that from several people, including Dr. Sheets and Dr. Baptista, and several folks who echoed those comments. I think on some of the other open questions, we heard that Class A recycling facilities, despite their statutory exclusion from our solid waste permitting rules, should be regulated in some way under the environmental justice regulations. I think we also heard that that scrap metal facilities are likely beyond what we put forth as a potential definition, that are kind of more auto scrap yards are things that we need to look at and focus on. And I think we also heard specifically that fumigation facilities are something that the department needs to look at and potentially focus on as we move forward. We also had some questions that about process and other things, which we have absolutely promised to include as part of our further conversations on this issue over the next couple of months. I think I summarized the things that particularly jumped out to me. Olivia, was there anything else that jumped out to you that you would want to add to that list?
Yes, there's one more, and it pertains to the geographic points of comparison. And I believe Dr. Joanne Held was one of the people who mentioned this. And it's about looking at different types of scales depending on the medium.
Yep.
So for some, look at geology, others watershed, and some the comparisons that we've put up today make sense.
Great, thank you, wonderful. Mm-hmm. And also, just that we need to make sure that our definitions on incinerators are broad enough to capture multiple combustion technologies and new emerging technologies, so we don't inadvertently limit the scope of what an incinerator is and might be considered to be in the future. So I think with that, Olivia, I'm happy to hand it back to you to talk about the next steps. And I just want to thank everyone for a really great conversation, and frankly, just absolutely fantastic feedback and stuff that we can now take back and work on. And I know we're gonna be better for it. So thank you all.
Yes, I absolutely ditto those sentiments. And I am just pulling out my cheat sheet here for some of our next steps. Okay. So I know that through some of the questions that were asked this evening, we said that they're going to be coming up as future topics of discussion. So I just wanted to give everyone a sense of what that timeline is for some of the meetings we plan to have in the next several weeks to couple months. So the next meeting we're looking at is going to be the week of February 15th. And at that point in time, we'll be looking at environmental and public health stressors. A couple weeks after that, in early March, the week of March 8th, we are looking at compelling public need and renewal conditions as a meeting topic. At the end of March, the week of March 29th, we're looking at process and environmental justice impact statements. And then shortly thereafter, we're going to have a button-up meeting where we kind of have an opportunity to revisit any of those topics that we've covered in any of those smaller topical sessions. So I would say just stay tuned for us to get specific dates for when each of those meetings are going to be held. And if you are not already getting our emails, our email address for this process is ejrulemaking@dep.nj.gov. And if I can ask Nadia Akbar, who works at DEP, if she can drop that email address in the chat. That's the best way to get emails directly from us that will keep you up to date on what's happening. And the other thing, again, I know it was already added to the chat some time ago, but it's actually our environmental justice website. It's nj.gov/DEP/EJ. Today's meeting, the PowerPoint presentation, the agenda, and everything from past meetings will all be available there on that website. And I will note, if you got the PowerPoint presentation emailed to you yesterday, it is slightly tweaked today. Of course, we always have to do our last minute refinement. And we added a slide in about the ground rules. So you'll see that the numbering is a little bit different. So that's why. So certainly look for a more recent version of that PowerPoint presentation. We'll be certain to get that out. So I believe that's all we have as a matter of process. If anyone else on our team thinks that I forgot anything, certainly feel free to chime in, but I think I covered it all. And certainly for the public, if you have any questions, certainly let us know.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.
You too all. Be well.
Thanks, everybody.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
question, whatever.